What is up, Mets fans? Welcome back to another episode of the Mets'd podcast. For those of you listening, again, I implore you to go over to YouTube, check out the video version on the Mets'd podcast. We're joined by a very special guest today, Zack Scott, former GM of the New York Mets. You've seen him on SNY, you've seen him on Twitter. He's talking baseball all over the place. Zack, appreciate you for joining us. How you been?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Zach, we want to start with the 2025 Mets because there's a lot of fanfare, hoopla going on right now. This team in spring training, dealing with some injuries early on. What's the feeling like for the executive when you see some guys start to go down in the spring? What's the level of urgency? What's going through your mind at that point?
Well, it's always, that's the pain of spring training, right? Like you're playing games that don't count but you know it's necessary to get your guys ready to go, especially your pitchers. And you're just hoping to get to the start of the season healthy, but you know you're not going to. So you're trying to be rational about it and not reactionary and not emotional when guys do get hurt and you find out they're going to miss a significant chunk of time. So you're trying to balance that, but you always have to remind yourself that it's not about having the perfect roster on opening day. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs, a lot of injuries throughout the season, and you're just managing some at the beginning, and there'll be different ones later when those guys come back. So you just try to keep a level head.
I know David Stearns has kind of, kept that same sentiment too. He said it last year that our bullpen opening day is not going to be what it looks like towards the end of the season. From a front office perspective, how many guys do you really expect or are you looking at that can be a part of the pitching rotation over a season? Because we know it's not just the major league level and it's not even just the 40-man roster.
Yeah, you have to plan to be as deep as you possibly can. That's why I actually really like what they've done with with the starters, but the bullpen as well. It's been a focus on depth, and I think they have a lot of good arms. You want to have roster flexibility. They maybe don't have a ton of that, but you just want to have as many arms as you can because it's going to take so many to get through the season. There's no one particular number, but that's really the goal is to build your roster for the 162 and don't be focused on having a perfect roster on day one.
You mentioned liking what David Stern's been doing right now. We're very encouraged by the year plus he's been here. I mean, the team went to the NLCS in the first year. He's found plenty of diamonds in the rough already, which was kind of one of his trademarks with the Brewers. When you look around Major League Baseball, or from your own experience working in different front offices, what are some of the symptoms of a good front office versus a bad front office?
It's a good question. I think the key to being successful in that role as a GM and as a baseball operation is to find that right balance between the short term and the long term, because you really have to do what's best for the organization, and everyone wants to have a sustainable winner. So that's a long term goal, right? To win all the time or as much as you can. At the same time, you have to be focused on this year's roster. And so, finding that balance is really difficult. And I think you see some teams be really good at focusing on the big picture long term and maybe are a little passive in the short term. So I think, and then there's other teams that kind of push their chips all in the middle for the short term, which can have some serious consequences for the long term. So I think if I had to say one key thing, that's really the challenge is finding the balance. But there's a lot of reasons why organizations are successful or not. I think teams that are constantly trying to innovate, always trying to get better. Even if you're good and you're just staying in the same place and not trying to get better, you're getting worse because everyone around you, especially in baseball, compared to other sports, is always trying to find that competitive edge. And then leadership, just having people on your team, on your staff, motivated and aligned to do what's best for the organization.
You were there towards the start of the Steve Cohen era, as us Mets fans call it. What were some of the things that you felt like he was doing with the organization to push this team in the right direction besides spending a lot of money?
Well, I was really there very early for Steve. So, year one as an owner, he's trying to figure out what kind of owner he's going to be. So, we took a different approach that year in terms of spending. We actually stayed under the luxury tax, which was, something that we planned on doing unless there was an opportunity that would lead to an exception to go over. So it was a slightly different approach to the approach that he's had since. But I think a lot of what Steve was doing was just trying to feel his way through it. It's not a normal thing to be an owner of a sports team. So when
No.
you're doing it for the first time, yeah, I think he tweets a lot less than he did that year. Um, there's, I think that times, he wanted to kind of show some tough love and maybe call out the team a little bit publicly. And I don't see that as much anymore. So I think he was really trying to feel out who he was going to be as an owner.
The big move that happened that offseason with the Mets was, of course, acquiring Francisco Lindor, signing the big contract in the precipice of the season. Then the season begins, and he's very clearly going through some struggles that he basically had never gone through as a Major League Baseball player before. I'm sure that there was no panic internally, but what were those feelings like inside the building of what's going on here? Is he comfortable? When's he going to turn it on and get it going?
Well, when I worked with Bill James at the Red Sox years ago, he used to always refer to this thing that he called the transition tax when you sign a big contract and go to a new team, especially in a market like Boston or New York. And in Francisco's case, coming from a market like Cleveland, which is very different. And so the expectations rise and expectations can be very challenging. So it didn't surprise me that he struggled. Um, I think that was to be expected to some degree, whether it was on the field or kind of in a new media market or a new spotlight on him that wasn't the same as before. Um, in general, I'm pretty even keeled person, so I wasn't panicking about it, but obviously, he wasn't feeling great about it. He felt a responsibility to the organization and to the fans to perform at a higher level. And I'm very happy to see that he's adjusted so well and is now a leader on that team and has performed extremely well.
Yeah, us Mets fans are super happy with that as well. The team looks really great. You talked about being very even keeled. If you know anything about Mets fans, which I'm sure you do, we're not an even keeled fan base. We love to be very reactionary. We love to wear our heart on our sleeve. Does the front, I don't want to say does the front office listen to the fans because I don't think that's the right question, but does the front office see how insane the fan base gets? Does the fan base input have any sort of maybe added pressure for the front office to succeed?
Does it feel? Do you guys feel the fans' emotion? I think is a
Yeah.
good way to phrase it.
Well, I mean, you're at the ballpark, right? So in the year that I was there, there was, fans were getting on some guys that were underperforming, and so yeah, you're aware of it. You can't avoid not knowing, but you try to tune it out because what you don't want to have happen is that to influence decisions you may make. But it's hard. It's hard for a lot of people in the organization. Like I said before, Steve is a new owner, so that's a new thing, right? Is you buy a team and you want to make fans happy, and if you're not performing well, they're not going to be happy, and that's understandable. But when things are going well, they're going to be great and they're going to be really supportive. And so, there's trade-offs with everything. But yeah, you can't get emotional. I stayed off of social media when I was in that role. I will say, Steve was very active and I was aware of his activity. And I think at one point he was actually asking for like ideas, trade ideas, things like that.
Yeah.
I actually read through some of them just to say, like, hey, I'm not going to pretend that, good ideas, I'm the only one that might have a good idea, or people that work there. I mean, good ideas can come from anywhere. So, I didn't necessarily see any that were too great or worth pursuing, but I was open-minded to say, hey, if usually rabid fan bases have very smart fans as well. So, I wanted to see that. But yeah, I was used to that from Boston. I felt like the New York fan base was a little different. I kind of expected them to be more like pre-2004 Red Sox fans, which I
Yeah.
was one of growing up in Boston. And kind of this woe is me waiting for the other shoe to drop kind of type of
Yeah.
mentality. And I felt like they were like that, but they were also like more angry about it.
That's just New
Like,
York. We're angry
yeah,
people.
it was like a combo somewhere between like Boston pre-04 and Philly, where there was just like
Hmm.
this angst about it. And so that's fine. I just love when people are passionate about the game. I'm passionate about the game, so I'm all for that.
Yeah, New Yorkers are just moving a million miles an hour all the time. You're in traffic, you're at work, you're going home in traffic, you're cooking dinner. Now the Mets are on. It's like, let's relax and watch the Mets. It never you
Right.
can't really tone down that quickly. But two players in this Mets team had very different times this winter going through their contract negotiation process. The first was Juan Soto, and the second was Pete Alonso. Now they're both on the Mets now. Really good to have both those guys in the lineup. But was there anything that surprised you specifically about how the contracts wound up coming out for either of those two players?
Really, no. I kind of, and I talked about this on SNY at the beginning of the offseason. I always felt like Soto, I always thought he'd end up with the Mets because I felt like he'd go to the highest bidder and they'd be the highest bidder. And I know there's some recent reports maybe suggesting that they weren't. Whatever. That aside, I felt like that they had a great chance to do that. The number itself was definitely higher than I expected in terms of present value. I expected it to get in the 700s, but I expected there would be heavy deferral, so it would be more of a present value, higher than Otani's present value of what 468,
Yeah.
but not 765. So that surprised me, the magnitude of that, for him to get almost $300 million more than the present value of Otani, seemed to kind of get away from what maybe made sense logically. But that happens in auctions. And then with Pete, I did feel like he was the most likely free agent to overplay his hand. I just think the market for his position with his skill set, at his starting age of a new contract, I don't think he was going to get what likely was a very high expectation. When you switch agents, and obviously he went to Scott Boras, but when you change agents, oftentimes you're doing that because the agent has set expectations that you can get a better deal than maybe the one he turned down. If he turned down a deal that was a pretty good offer from the Mets before, and then switches agents, to me, that's sending a message that he thinks he should get even more. And I thought that was a very high risk strategy for him. So it didn't surprise me that he was hanging around really late. And ultimately, I think the deal made sense that he, probably had to come down from expectations, or they had to manage expectations down for him to take it. But I think it made sense for the Mets and for the short term for the player.
FT fam, I hope you have as much confidence as Penelope right now, who is an avid Spot and Tango fan, okay? And she uses the code FOUL, Kratz, because this is a personalized dog food subscription service that prevents you, of course, from going to the store to pick up the food. And she just gets the highest quality unkibble. That is what they're known for. And I know you love the quiz part of it, too.
It's a super quick quiz, but it lets you give them the information and they tailor it to what is needed based on their age, size, activity level, all things that are custom for each and every one of your dogs.
Yeah, human grade ingredients in that unkibble. USDA meat, fruits, and veggies that are approved there. No artificial stuff, no preservatives. They've got the exclusive deal for the FT fam for a limited time. Go to spotandtango.com/foul. Use code FOUL to get 50% off your first order. That's spotandtango.com/foul. It's spotandtango.com/foul, code foul.
A player like Juan Soto's contract, it seems like it's almost impossible for it to be ever worth it, but he's
Right.
such a unique player and so young and so good. How do you truly value a player like Juan Soto? Because I think we all know $50 million a year when he's 40 years old is going to look absolutely insane. But do you not care about that right now because you're getting one of the best players in baseball and during his prime?
I mean, I think if you're a GM, you always care about that because, like I said before, you're trying to manage the balance between the short term and long term. Now, crystal balling 15 years down the road is really hard.
Yeah.
How many collective bargaining agreements will we have gone through by then? What's the landscape going to look like? And that's one of the challenges about making these decisions on contracts like that is, luxury tax rules can change. There could be a lot of differences. The economy of baseball could change. There's a lot of things up in the air with TV deals and all that. So you don't know what the landscape's going to look like that far down the road. So I wouldn't say though you don't care. You're just you sometimes can't get too focused on it because it's hard to predict beyond 3 years, let alone 15 years. So you just want to try to manage that risk as best you can. And I think when you take on that risk, and I've heard quotes from David Stern since signing it makes it really hard to then add another guy like that because you're just compounding risk and making, financial flexibility or lack thereof is really how big market teams can fall apart. And, I say that from experience. Before the Dodgers bailed us out in 2012 from Crawford and Gonzalez,
Yep.
we were looking at a really tough situation where we were like, what did we do? We got these long-term contracts, limited flexibility. We better be pumping out young talent that's cheap and controllable. And then the Dodgers just bailed us out and kind of reset for us, which was huge. And so you can't depend on something like that happening. So you got to be really careful because you've seen it. I mean, I think the Mets under, like, I think Phillips was probably the GM. They had similar issues with some financial things that just
Yeah.
paralyzed them. It paralyzed them for a while. The Cubs in the, I want to say, the Jim Henry years, and I'm not saying this to pick on them. I'm just to reference it. Same thing where, they spent a lot and it didn't work out, and then it was like, okay, now we are kind of paralyzed because we don't have that flexibility. We got to wait these things out. So it's hard, but you also manage risk by infusing young talent, and that's how you balance it. You look at your roster as, I hate talking about players like they're assets, but you look at it like a portfolio that you're trying
Yeah.
to manage. And you have, the reason in Boston we felt like we could sign David Price to a high risk contract that, in a vacuum was a bad contract, but he helped us win a World Series. So you kind of take that with that. You'll take that. But the reason we felt like we could take that risk is because we had such a good young core: Mookie Betts, Andrew Benintendi, Jackie Bradley, Rafi Devers, guys that were going to be producing a lot more than they were going to be getting paid. And so you could kind of balance that. I think a team like the Mets, like, they're going to have to do the same thing. And like more Vientos types, right, that are going to be producing well over what they're earning.
Piggybacking on this, when you're making these kinds of decisions in the front office, what's the spread or what's the ratio of how much you're looking internally, like you're talking about the pieces you have, how much risk you can take on, versus how much you're looking externally at the teams you're competing with? Because this Mets team, while they probably do want to mitigate risk and not put on another monster contract in the next few years, whether it be a Vlad Guerrero Jr. or someone else along with Lindor and Soto, you have to look at the Dodgers and be like, this is our direct competition for a championship. And they're paying Otani, they're paying Betts, they're paying Yamamoto. They have 3 of those monster contracts on the team. And that's before a very long-term deal for a catcher in Will Smith and a high AAV deal and a first baseman, Freddie Freeman, is still at the top of his game, but beginning to break down a little bit. Someone's going to have load management this year. So again, the way I said at the beginning, how much you're looking internally versus the risk you have to mitigate versus externally, how can we be better than team A, B, and C?
You try not to focus on what other teams are doing because you can't control it, right? So you just like we always tell our players, focus on what you can control. You do the same thing when you're building a team, but you have to be aware of it. You want to know where where you put your odds of making the playoffs and having success are. Obviously, you care about where you are in your expected win curve, right? If you're a team that's not expected to compete, then why would you spend a ton of money to go from 70 wins to 75 wins, that sort of thing. So you have to be aware of it to some extent. You have to have a realistic view on who you are. Be realistic on your expectations for who your team is and where does that fit in the context of your division. So you have to have some awareness, but you can't get caught up in an arms race. And I say that as someone that was in Boston, where we sometimes did get caught up in that arms race with the Yankees, but it's really hard and it's dangerous. So you can do it when you have resources, but you got to just be careful. And, the risks, everything you do is a risk. So going with young players, that's a risk. It may not cost you financially. And some teams, I think today, some leaders feel very safe going young because if they fail, they don't create that flexibility problem. You can pivot more easily. They have they can be options. So you can actually maneuver around it more easily. But it's a risk that they're not that good, and therefore your team's not that good. So everything you do, every decision that you make in those roles is a risk.
Has team building changed because of the expanded playoff era? Are teams a little more comfortable, you feel like, because you don't have to be the best in your division necessarily to make the playoffs?
Yeah, I found even before the playoff format changed, I found it felt like the industry was becoming more risk averse. And in the, especially on the big spends, and obviously not everyone has resources. So there's certain
Sure.
teams like Tampa Bay is not going to be spending big money. They're doing a great job with the constraints that they have. But it just felt like there were more and more teams saying like, playing it a little safer financially. And then I think when you did change the playoff format, that made that even more of an incentive to not push all your chips in the middle, which again, that can be a bad strategy. I'm not saying
Yeah.
it's a bad thing that they're being a little safer, but I do think there are opportunities for teams like the Mets and there's GMs, known for being aggressive. I worked for one with Dave Dombrowski. I consulted with Chris Young. He's an aggressive guy.
Yeah.
And there's certain guys, AJ Preller's aggressive. There's certain guys that are aggressive that can kind of take advantage of the fact that maybe some other teams are playing it really safe.
There was a very aggressive trade that you did make when you were at the helm with the Mets, and that was the famous trade deadline, the Javy Baez move. Mark and I remember that one pretty fondly because we were about to head to the ballpark. It was a Friday, I believe, afternoon, and we were live streaming the trade deadline. And our listeners will still sometimes go back and take the screen grab of our jaws dropping and our eyes bugging out of our head when we saw the Javy Baez Crow-Armstrong. Looking back, what kind of made that trade happen? How did it get to that point? And where was the thought process in the moment of pushing chips in and bargaining the future for the present?
Well, there are, you have a lot of conversations. I think one of the things, and I spoke about this publicly at the time, one of the challenges in that moment in time was the perception by the industry of the Mets farm system.
Mm.
It was viewed as having a couple really good prospects at the top and then a significant drop off, which I don't necessarily think was true, but that was how teams communicated to me. That's how they viewed it. And, I felt like it didn't have that middle tier prospect where those are the players that you want to deal from when you're making trades at the deadline. So, I looked at Crow-Armstrong as someone that was in our top 5 to 7 prospects, which I thought was a below average farm system. So in some teams that might be like closer to 10. In hindsight, that's low because he ended up taking off after the trade and becoming like the 12th. Like I don't think he was a top 100 prospect at that in 21, but then he's like 12th overall or something as a prospect. So good for him. I liked Pete a lot. I loved the defense, loved the makeup. The question was the bat. And, I definitely was biased by coming over from Boston. We weren't high on him in the draft. And so I thought there was a lot of fourth outfielder risk. And I think some of the people internally, even though they drafted him and obviously valued him highly if they used a first round pick on him, felt similarly. Like there is a risk that he doesn't hit. And that he's going to have great defense. There was no doubt about that. So he might be able to carry. If he doesn't hit, he still might be able to be an everyday guy because the defense is so elite and the base running is elite. But I think there was risk. So, that was more than I think typically I'd want to deal in a trade like that. But at the time, I felt like it was the best we could do given our circumstances, which were, we were in first place, I believe, that day. Starting to fade a little bit in a division that wasn't performing well. The Braves ended up taking off and becoming the Braves that we know. But, we had an opportunity, and I am a big believer that when you have an opportunity to make the postseason, that you make the most of it, especially when you have a player like Jake DeGrom who could kind of help carry you through a postseason. Now, that was one of the challenges was we're making that trade, and Jake, we get a very unclear health picture on Jake that same day, really that same time, which makes it really challenging. But it was, we had a bunch of those with Jake that year before that. And so to me, it was unclear and we didn't really know like how serious is this because sometimes other things seem serious and then they weren't. So it was one of those years where it just was unclear what was going on with him. So, I think it's obvious to say in hindsight that that was an overpay. I felt like at the time it was an overpay because it's a rental. And yes, we got Williams back and he's actually very good for 2 years or a year and a half for the Mets. But you'll never do a rental deal unless it's just for like fringy guys that you're, like the Rich Hill deal we did. That's a rental deal with like a fringy prospect, but it's a different level of player, right? Like we got a player who was very good for us in Baez and was a good fit for what we were looking for. But
some of the best baseball I ever played was there.
it was during that time. But I look at it. It was an overpay at the time. It ended up being a bigger overpay when Pete took a huge step forward as a player, which is good for him and good for Cubs PD. But, the circumstances were, it was very clear we weren't just trading for Rich Hill at the deadline. We were going to do something more significant.
How, close to the deadline did that deal actually happen? Because, again, for us on the outside, it's like that came in as a buzzer beater deal towards the end, right as it was ending. Was that something that had been done for a while before the actual deadline?
Well, I mean, it's really hard to pull off any deal without really having an agreement like an hour before the deadline at least, because you got to go through medical reviews, and there's just you got to get in touch with. There's just a lot of administrative stuff that has to happen. So it's really hard to pull off a deal last minute. It used to be easier. When I first started, like we traded Nomar Garciaparra with like a minute left at the deadline in a 4-team trade, which is insane.
That was a legendary
nuts.
trade.
But it's a lot. It was harder. There was more kind of red tape you had to deal with. So it was probably about an hour before. But I wanted to wait as long as possible, especially when we started having conversations about Jake. I want to make sure I knew it was what the deal was. We were actually talking about a much larger deal with the Cubs that involved several players coming from there to us, and us sending more players. And it was complicated, but that was something that I think could have made a bigger impact on the team. And then it was kind of like, well, that would have been even bigger risk in some ways. It would have been pushing more chips in the middle. So we decided to take this approach instead.
Can you speak on the parameters of what that larger trade could have been now looking back?
I'll talk about some of it just because, there's some players. There's at least one player still with the Mets, so I'd rather not put him in a weird spot or the organization. But yeah, I mean, Contreras was coming to us in that deal. McCann and some cash was going to them. Dom Smith was involved going over there. Craig Kimbrell was involved coming to. I mean, it was just, and then obviously Baez was trying to actually get Bryant involved as well, but they had a separate deal that they liked better anyway with him, and I think that he went to a place that was a better fit for him than New York anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we were talking about something that was kind of a one-stop shop type trade.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there would have been more coming from us prospect wise, but I just don't want to.
Yeah, no, that's
divulge those
okay.
names.
No, that's fine. We're honestly more interested in the guys who could have been coming here because one of the things I want to know is like what was maybe like a crazy trade that didn't happen that was players coming to the Mets. I don't care who was leaving.
Yeah, I mean that's probably the
That would have
biggest
been the
one.
Yeah.
I remember in the off season, I don't remember if this was before. I think it was before we signed Ty Walker. I was talking to the Brewers about Corbin Burns. And he that was the first year he was going to be a starter, like
Yes.
full-time starter. And obviously he goes on and wins the Cy Young. But it was a conversation that, wasn't with David Stearns, it was with Matt Arnold. And I couldn't get a read. It wasn't like a quick no. It was something that, they thought about, we talked about. Obviously nothing happened. But I remember thinking, it's funny because not everyone on our side was like gung-ho about it because he hadn't proven himself as a starter yet, right? And that to me was why you might be able to get him, right? Is that you're taking a little bit of a risk that he's going to be able to handle a workload and things like that. So that obviously would have been great. He goes out, wins the Cy Young, but I have no idea if that was something that they were like laughing at internally or what. But that would have been kind of interesting.
Would have been
good.
Would you say smaller things that almost happened that probably aren't as exciting to your audience?
When you say you couldn't get a read on Matt Arnold, just this might be a little bit of a silly question, but how does an actual trade talk begin? Are you sending a text? Are you giving a call? Is it an email? Does it depend on your familiarity with the other executive? What's the actual operational process of beginning these conversations?
Well, that year was especially odd because we went through 3 different point people on our end, right? So, Sandy was running point. You take the Lindor trade, like Sandy's first talking to Cleveland, and then Jared comes on as GM, and then he still let Sandy run point, but like the conversation flowed through Jared as running point as the GM, and then he's gone, and then I'm in that seat. So, I was typically what you do is you divvy up the teams between people, and so it's like, okay, Zach, you're going to handle these 10 teams to reach out and check in with them. And then obviously if things evolve, then other people may get involved. So I had been doing that as an assistant GM, and then I switch over to the acting GM seat. And so now it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to just all of a sudden be, well, now I'm going to talk to just the GMs, like big league, the assistant GM. So I kept talking to the same people. With that one, or in general, it's typically text these days. Sometimes it's a call. It depends. I mean, I always lead with a text because, if it's to set up a call, and it's like, hey, would love to kind of chat about what you guys are looking to do as you get closer to the deadline. There's kind of this thing where every team checks in with each other just to get a sense of where they're at. And you might learn something from that in terms of what they see their needs as, and whether you have a fit for that, or whether they ask specifically about a player on your team, and the other way, where you may say like, hey, would you ever talk about this guy? Or, this is what we're looking for. Do you have any players that fit that you'd be willing to talk about? Those are kind of the first conversations, and then you go from there. So in a case like that we had a player that they were interested in, and so it became a conversation about what kind of value we would need to be talking about to be able to move a player like that.
So like, just again, this might sound crazy, but like, you just be like, hey, like, what's the deal with Corbin Burns? Like, are you guys like looking to move him? Is that how like casual it is, or is it more?
Sometimes for me it was. So I think I've worked for different GMs that have different approaches. I tended to be very quick to reach out to people. I wanted to have as much information about the market as possible. So I would reach out all the time to people, be like, hey, crazy, some people don't like to brainstorm with you. So like you get it like, hey, how do you feel about this? Like, if I, are you cool with just kind of like shooting ideas? And some people are like, yeah, shoot me any idea, even if it seems crazy. And I definitely like shot off a few texts that were just kind of like taking a temperature, and someone wrote back like, are you serious? I'm like, no, I was totally kidding. But why not? You can't get a player if you don't ask about them sometimes. And there's players that have been moved. I'll say when Oakland traded Josh Donaldson, and when the Marlins traded Miguel Cabrera, like really good players that moved that my team didn't explore because either in the Cabrera case, the Marlins were probably just focusing on who had the prospects that they really wanted in order to pull the trigger in a trade like that. In Donaldson's case, actually, they told us he wasn't going to be traded, and then he was traded. So you can't. I learned from those experiences and others that you have to be involved. You have to get yourself in the mix as much as possible. And some people don't like to do that. They want to be like very focused on kind of clear fits and a team being motivated to move someone. And I'd rather have a conversation, and because maybe you can motivate them to do something.
I'm taken aback by how similar some of these like contexts and situations sound to fantasy leagues that I know I play in. I know that Mark plays in too, just about having those relationships. Is there something to the fact that we see a lot of teams link up for trades all the time between two teams? We see the A's and the Braves trade all the time. We've seen the Brewers and the Rays trade all the time. Is there something just simple, the person-to-person relationship, making it easier to get some deals done?
I think it can be. I think their styles are more, the styles of the different teams is more a driver. There are some teams that are deal makers, right? Like I mentioned before, they're aggressive. Like those are usually teams you want to talk to because you might actually get a deal done. And it doesn't mean you're going to like fleece them. You're trying to get fair deals. That the goal isn't to win a deal. It's to do something that makes sense for your club. And so you're matching up on what makes sense for them, the timing of where they're at, versus where your organization's at. But then there's other teams that you kind of, feel like they're sometimes doing an academic exercise where, and some people get very frustrated by that. And I, at times I got frustrated, and it's like, I think they're just information gathering and, throwing out things that are never going to happen and wasting my time. I didn't get mad about it, but I know some people do. To the point where they'll say, hey, this team's calling me. I actually remember having conversations, the Cubs that year traded a bunch of players, right?
Yes.
They were at the big fire sale. And I remember I was talking to Jed Hoyer a lot because we were in on a bunch of those players. And I remember at one point he was saying, hey, I have a bandwidth issue, right? I got to trade a bunch of people in this time period and get the best deals I can. So I'm going to be very focused when I think there's actually a potential deal. And there's not teams, I got to weed out the teams that are probably just, he didn't say this, but I'm saying this, kind of going through a little bit of an academic exercise.
Yeah.
And just kind of put them aside, which I thought was interesting and made sense. It's like, you just can't waste time. So, there's certain teams that I know I heard after the fact, like, oh, he wouldn't return our calls. And I'm thinking, Yeah, because he had a lot to do, and
Yeah, busy.
it takes sometimes it takes like 50 calls with certain teams to get a deal done. Just grind and grind and grind, and some teams we refer to as the grinder, or certain organizations, and you actually see like GM trees that way. Like
Mm.
I'm grew up under Theo Epstein, and like Theo Epstein's a deal maker,
Yeah.
and most of the people that worked under him that ended up going on to those roles were also deal makers, and that was kind of, it didn't mean reckless, but being aggressive but thoughtfully so, was kind of the way of most of the people that came up under Theo. And I think there's other trees that you see that are significantly more conservative, whether that's because they kind of grew out of a smaller market or what. And so it is interesting because that's what can create some roadblocks on getting trades done.
I think I could talk about all this like very in-depth trade stuff and like front office stuff for like another hour, but I think we're going to ask you each one more question just to wrap this up. We don't want to take too much more of your time. Taking a look back at the Mets, who's a player in the organization that you feel like maybe Mets fans, the media, just in general, are kind of doubting, maybe sleeping on a little bit too much?
I think it's easy to look at some of the younger players that haven't really made it yet, like Brett Beatty. I mean, he was such a good prospect, and there were things he needed to work on. He wasn't really pulling the ball much, and that was a concern that he wouldn't get to his power that frequently because of that. I haven't been following it that closely, but it looks like he's been showing some pull power, at least this spring. I mean, I still think he has some upside, but it's really, they have a situation with him and Mauricio and Acuna and maybe someone else I'm forgetting, where this is their last option year.
Yep.
So like they had to figure out who they are, or else all of a sudden your value kind of craters if it hasn't already, which it probably has in some cases. So, I'm not going to say he's going to make a big impact this year necessarily for them, but I still think he's an undervalued player.
This is going to be a very different question. You wrote a big piece for MLB Trade Rumors last month about deferrals and kind of what they mean internally versus their public perceptions. I think the way that some fans look at it is that the Dodgers are using these deferrals to ruin the game and kind of take advantage of like a roster building hack, where it seems like people on the inside don't consider them very much, and players seem to like them. The players union seems to like a deferral. So what kind of maybe surmise the article a little bit and talk about where the public might miss what deferrals actually mean and do for team building.
Yeah, I think especially because Ohtani was such an extreme example of deferrals, it's gotten a lot of attention. It's not a new strategy to try to get a deal done. We've just seen it so frequently. The Dodgers have done this where they've deferred a lot of money, and in their case, also given signing bonuses to those players. So you've just seen like pretty extreme contract structures coming from them. All that really matters is the present value, right? Like, it's the reason I wrote the article was because people were saying like, oh, they should have a luxury tax number of 70, should be the number or whatever, on Ohtani. And I strongly disagree with that, because that's not the real value. I mean, he's deferred so much money that, a dollar now is definitely more valuable than, however many years later he's getting it. So we can't just ignore that. Now, can every team do that? No, but it's not different than the situation that exists in baseball and has for years. Like the haves can do stuff like that and the have-nots cannot. So, I mean, they can do it just on a smaller scale. So, I just don't think that in particular, that mechanism of a contract structure is what creates potential imbalance or unfairness. It's the actual revenue discrepancy in dollars that those teams have. So that was really the point of the article. Was it's not about contract structures. It's the same thing it's always been about, which is just having more money than the next guy.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that makes baseball unique. No salary cap, and it definitely operates a lot different than all the other sports. But Zach, thank you so much for coming on. It was absolutely a pleasure to have you. Let everybody know at home where they can find you, what you're up to, and plug all your stuff that you want.
Yeah, you can find me on @Zack Scott Sports on really any social channel. And yeah, and you'll see, like you mentioned, I've been starting to write some articles for MLB Trade Rumors. There's another one this week that's coming out as early as today, about really the medical review process that goes into signing free agents and before you do trades, and kind of see it as relevant as some guys with the Mets and Yankees have signed contracts this offseason and immediately had significant injuries. And I've heard some people say, well, how did they not know this before they signed the guy? So it's really about that process and how it's a lot more art than science. But yeah, so I'm writing articles there. And as you mentioned before, I'm on SNY about once a week on their weeknight show, Baseball Night in New York.
Awesome. Zach, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And we'll talk to you guys on the next episode.
Thanks, guys.